I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling, but out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Hello everyone, welcome back to Outside the Therapy Room. Today I am joined by Arsh again. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We are talking about neurodiversity today, and I thought we would just start off with a disclaimer, kind of letting everybody know that today we're going to be talking about neurodiversity in a more general lens and through our own experiences. So we're not showing up as experts. We are showing up outside the therapy room.
Yes.
So we just wanted to bring attention and hopefully a little bit of education or your different perspective of neurodiversity. Is there anything you want to add to our little disclaimer?
No, I think that about covers it, right? I think this is a very, very vast topic and it's a very, very growing one. So language is constantly shifting and changing. And so, we'll do our best to kind of use the language that's considered most appropriate as of right now, but it's possible that can change, over time. It's impossible to know everything around this topic. I would say my special interest a little bit aligns a bit more towards autism and ADHD. But even within that, there's just so much to know. And so I think that, I think the biggest thing here is we're not coming here as experts, but sharing sort of our understanding from our experiences, both my personal experiences as well as my professional ones. So
yeah, and I think too, it's such a huge topic.
Oh yeah,
it could be a podcast all on its own.
Absolutely.
With different focuses each week, one day. But I think too, in the future, I'm hoping that we can kind of be a little bit more specific about certain things work and school, relationships, procrastination, which is a big thing that we'll talk about today.
Yeah.
And executive functioning, dysfunction, all of those things that are going to be more specific topics some point in the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess to start us off, we'll give you a general term of what neurodiversity is. So neurodiversity acknowledges the whole spectrum of neurodiversity from neurodivergent folks to neurotypical folks. Neurodivergent is having a mind that functions differently than what is considered to be the norm. So that's including processing, interpreting, feelings, etc. Neurotypical, as it sounds, it refers to as having a mind that functions and falls within society's standards of what's deemed typical, common or normal, I guess. And then neurodiverse is a term that we use to describe a group of individuals who represent the spectrum of neurodiversity, which I guess includes neurotypical folks and neurodivergent folks.
Yeah, it's the whole spectrum, but you could kind of talk about specific groups within the neurodiverse group, population.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say kind of neurodiversity is just the idea that, we are all wired differently. And no two brains are the same, but we can have different neurotypes. All right, but yeah, I think neurodiversity kind of covers it's the whole spectrum.
Thing. Yeah, so I think today we're going to be focusing more on the neurodivergent population. So what is there? I guess we asked some questions on social media, and I guess one of the questions was what falls under neurodivergent umbrella. And I think I was telling you before we recorded that I didn't know that dyslexia fell under neurodivergent umbrella.
Yeah.
And so what are some other, I guess what just in general falls under that lens?
So from my understanding, anything that is outside of what's considered neurotypical, would kind of fall under that. So from my understanding, ADHD, autism, those I feel are considered those are kind of the main things people first think of
Yeah,
as neurodivergent.
yeah.
But like, right, but like dyslexia, all learning disabilities really, right, like would fall under that neurodivergent, because we talked, right, like about how neurodivergent just it's a different way of learning, processing, interpreting. It's a different way of interacting with the world than what is considered neurotypical, right? And so all kinds of learning disabilities would sort of fall under that. There's dyscalculia. I don't even know. There's the math one.
Yeah, the math one.
Dyslexia is like, right, with words. But like all kinds of learning disabilities would fall under the neurodivergent umbrella. And like, I'm not an expert in this one, but I know I've read up on, right, like how, right, like schizophrenia and like bipolar disorder, like all of those things actually would fall under the neurodivergent umbrella from some papers and things like that I've read. Because again, it's a different wiring of the brain, a different way of interpreting the world and interacting with the world and processing the world. And so it sort of seems to me that like kind of anything that is outside of neurotypical technically falls under neurodivergent. But it sounds like it sounds like ADHD and autism kind of tend to be what people think of first as like falling under neurodivergent.
I would agree. And I think too, the term is relatively new. I think we haven't really used it too much in the past. It's definitely like a new, I think like a nicer way of categorizing the diagnosis and all of that. And so it is definitely new. But with that, I got like the research that you have read, there's probably a lot of different things that could fall under neurodivergent umbrella, and some that we may still be figuring it out because it is such a new term.
This is a very like a growing topic, right?
It's
where a lot more research is going into it now, which is good, which is a good thing. It's important for us to really understand, right? Like, whereas right in the past, with like the medical model, which still exists unfortunately, right? Like the idea is, and like not all medical model, but like the classic traditional medical model, like the idea of, right, like we kind of see people who are neurodivergent, we look at them through like a deficit-based lens compared to what's, you know, considered typical. So I think the idea with this new language is that it's not less than, it's different, right? And of course, depending on the severity of, right, like one's cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities and things like that, of course there are going to be things that very much fall in that disability place, right? Like where like people are very, very impacted by these things. We can't erase the difficulty that comes with being neurodivergent for some folks. Absolutely. And at the same time, we also, I think, are trying to find this balance and recognizing that, you know, it doesn't just mean that people are less than or like, you know, incapable. It means that people's brains are wired a little bit differently. And for a lot of folks, it's kind of living in a world that isn't designed for neurodivergent folks also adds to the problem. It's not just that their brain is wired differently. It's just that like the world doesn't really take into account that there are different brains, and we have to actually find ways to support all different brains, not just one type of brain.
I think a huge example of that is the classroom.
Right?
Like there's a classroom and it's set up to teach people in this one way, but like, you know, sitting down, reading materials, staying in your seat for long periods of time. And not everybody can do that. Like I know, like as we got older, I'm even thinking like university courses, some classes were like almost 2 hours long, and sitting in the chairs, sometimes there'd be no breaks, or there'd be like really quick bathroom breaks. But that's a really long time to be expected to sit and actually absorb the information that is being taught to you in that moment. And I know a lot of kiddos that are younger struggle with that too. And one thing that I'm really appreciating now, as you know, we're talking a little bit more about this, and it's not as stigmatized, I think, hopefully, as it used to be. There has been so much maybe so much is a big word, but there's been some progress that has been made in classrooms.
Yes.
But I think it is also dependent on the school,
Yes.
the funding,
Yeah.
the educators, and the
Absolutely.
support that
Yeah.
those educators have for the classroom. But
Absolutely.
I have heard from my kiddos being like, oh, these two kids go on, like energy walks. So they'll get up in the middle of class and go on an energy walk. I sometimes want to go on an energy walk, and I'm like, that's totally valid. If you need to go on an energy walk, you take your own walk, but those kids maybe have actual time that they have those energy walks. So
Absolutely.
you can go to the washroom, take a little walk, and then come back. But it is interesting to hear from my kiddos all of the supports that are in place.
Yeah.
There's my youngest kiddo mentioned that a little friend in his class has a special, he calls it a dot, but I think it's like a circle pillow, but it's rubber and it has some spikes on it. And he says he sits on that on his chair, and when it's circle time, he'll sit on it on the floor. And so there are some aids that are there to kind of support with movement.
Absolutely.
But I guess the movement is like, what then? I guess it's like, okay, well, what is that?
Yes.
Some of it can be like, again, under the neurodivergent umbrella, but I think a lot of the times the diagnosis that we are hearing a lot more of is ADHD. And ADHD actually went through a change, if I'm not mistaken. Again, not the expert in this topic, but my understanding is that ADHD used to be like just looked at like hyperactivity, whereas now I believe it's kind of split into 3 parts. So ADHD inattentive, ADHD hyperactive, and then a combined
type. Yes. So actually, they used to call it. There was ADD.
Yes.
And ADHD.
That's what I was
so
trying to say.
So technically, ADD was inattentive. And ADHD was the hyperactive, but now
it has the H for the hyperactive. Yeah,
exactly. Whereas now, what they've kind of come to realize is like they're not two separate things. They're like different types of the same thing.
It presents
different presentations.
Yes,
of the same thing. So you can have hyperactive, you can have inattentive, or you can have combined.
Yeah, I think we definitely hear more about the hyperactive, right?
That's the like stereotypical.
Yes.
Yeah. That's kind of like the stereotypical, like it's a kiddo that's like bouncing off the walls and can't sit still. It's funny because I'm like noticing how much I'm fidgeting.
Like my husband's always shaking his foot, and I'm like, babe,
the restlessness.
Stop shaking your foot. You're shaking the whole car or like the couch. Like, please stop. I love you. Please stop.
It's funny.
But it's seen that way, and I think it's like that in movies and shows too. Like I'm thinking about Modern Family.
Oh yeah.
Like I think Alex, the middle sibling, there's an episode where she reads off what ADHD symptoms are, and
Luke and the dad.
Claire, the wife, is thinking about the dad, and she's talking about Luke,
and she's like, oh.
And, but it is that like that's what we see is the hyperactive piece of it. But I guess then what is inattentive? What falls under that?
So like the inattentive, again, right from kind of my understanding and diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, which, interesting. A little hyperactive right now, but it's okay. But yeah, from my understanding, inattentive is right. Like it's the one that gets missed more.
Yeah.
And research also has kind of shown that sometimes like I've seen both. So like take this with a grain of salt, but like that sometimes those born female are potentially more tend to have more inattentive and like maybe, but that could also just be a societal thing. So who knows?
Yeah.
But the idea is that, inattentive would be like that kiddo that's like in their own head a lot, very absent-minded, daydreaming, forgets everything, loses everything. Like the amount of times as a kid I heard like, where are you? Like, where's your head? Or like, okay, go get me this. And I'd go there and then I'd come back and be like, what was I supposed to get? Or like getting in trouble for like losing everything and like you can't have nice things because you lose everything. Like those kinds of things, which like, right, like, they didn't know and I didn't know. And back when, we were younger, like these things were less known. right? But like, it's cool that we're having so much more, what's the word? Like, we're just this awareness and this understanding and this like education that we now have, that we can kind of look at these things a little differently, right? Like, these kiddos aren't just like lazy. They're not just, you know, like not trying.
Yeah.
Their brains are wired a little differently, and they need different strategies. So like, this guy is my best friend.
Your phone, you're holding up your phone.
Yes. Oh, right. Because there's a video.
It's a video, but the audio, yes.
That's the audio. Yes. I'm holding up my phone.
Yes. And that's your best friend.
It's my best friend. Because I put everything in it.
Yeah.
Because I can't use an agenda. Because I will not check my agenda. I will write something in my agenda, but then
or you
who's
lose
gonna remind
it. It's
me?
so easy to lose agenda.
And then who's going to remind me to check my agenda?
Right.
Right? But my phone will beep at me and be
Yeah.
like, hey, look at me. It buzzes at me. It beeps at me. It, you know, has like lights and, you know, and it draws my attention and is like, hey, you have this thing coming up that you need to do. Hey. And to the extent that, like, right, like, you know, when you get really focused on things, you'll forget to eat. You'll forget to go use the bathroom. Like, you can't really... Depending on how severe it is for you, you can't really rely on those internal cues. You kind of need those external cues to give you that, like, support to be like, hey, you have this thing coming up, you need to do this thing, la 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 la. Like, I could go on forever, but like, generally speaking, like, inattentive ADHD, that's what it kind of is. And that's why it kind of gets missed more, because
it's more internal.
It's more internal,
Like hyperactivity, you see it.
You see it
right?
outwardly.
And it causes a disturbance, quote unquote, to other people.
Exactly.
Which I think is maybe, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about diagnosis to different genders, but I think that it can come from that, especially for women, because they're like, oh, look at that. She's so good. She's so quiet. She's over there.
Exactly.
But
that's
really,
the
there's
piece I was talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think so. Some of the things that you mentioned: distractibility, overlooks details, forgetfulness, loses objects, difficulty regulating attention and focus.
Yeah.
And the other piece that I found interesting was that ADHD and attentive is often diagnosed later in life. So again, it's not seen. It's not a disturbance to other people, and therefore it gets missed maybe at a younger age.
When I got diagnosed. So.
There's so much now, especially in my work with clients and even outside of work. There's been so many more of like friends of mine or family members of mine, clients of mine who have been diagnosed later in life. And it's really interesting, and we'll dive into that afterwards.
Yes.
More likely to have internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression, listening difficulties, processing speed is also impacted.
Yeah.
And then, as we mentioned, like hyperactivity is often something that we see more externally. So it's impulsivity, fidgety, restlessness, can interrupt people. I sometimes struggle with that, but I don't have a diagnosis, but sometimes I'm like, I meet some of these. More likely to have co-occurring externalizing disorders like OGD and CD. More common among males is something that's on this article as well, which again, interesting. And it's often diagnosed early in childhood, and it often talks excessively. And like we mentioned, like ADHD combined is then both of these things.
Yeah, you kind of like equally having, like, you don't kind of necessarily severely lean towards one or the other, right? Like, you're kind of equally presenting symptoms or signs or traits of both.
Yeah, and like, I guess we're kind of talking about it now, like how... There's been a lot of research, and I remember learning this, like, you know, through my professional development and also in my psychology courses back during my undergrad, that there was a lot more of that focus on boys having a lot of energy, being disruptive in class, and then a lot of them were diagnosed with ADHD. And a diagnosis of ADHD can be helpful because it allows us to understand that somebody maybe needs a little bit more support with certain things, or gives us more patience for how to handle, you know, teaching or learning or direction with like the ADHD folks. But I think for women, it's often not noticed when we are younger. And I think, again, this is from my personal life and also in an article that I read where it was women are the ones that are getting diagnosed a lot later in life.
Yeah, absolutely, right? I think, And I mean, I could go into a whole thing with this, but then there's like misdiagnosis as well, right?
Yeah.
Like individuals being misdiagnosed because of, right? Like, so maybe like, sometimes I think like, those born female can sometimes be like misdiagnosed with other things.
Yeah.
Because like, it's just not.
It's not the hyperactive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so like, I think like it can get like really, really complicated, right?
Yeah.
But I think, especially with the inattentive, like we kind of said, because it's not necessarily always outwardly disruptive, and it's more of like this internal thing that's kind of happening. And as kids, like, who really knows how to describe what's actually happening for them internally, right? Like, and if this is why, right? Like, this isn't just on parents, like this is on society as a whole.
Yeah.
Like, we need to provide this information to all of the population, right? Something that you had been mentioning when we were talking about classrooms, we were talking about like, these new aids and fidgets that have been implemented and breaks and things like that, like making society more neurodivergent friendly is actually helpful for everybody. Not just neurodivergent folks, right?
Yeah.
Like neurotypical individuals just as much would benefit from these things. Maybe not just as much, but like, I think they could still benefit from those things, right? I think what the difference is, like, they could really benefit from it, whereas neurodivergent people just need it.
Yeah.
They need it to actually function in the world. But neurotypical people could very much benefit from it as well. Right?
Yeah.
I went on some weird tangents.
That's okay. Like, again, like our last episode, love your tangents. There's so much information in them. But yeah, I think for a lot of those born female, I think you're right. It's often passed as something else. Like, oh, they're shy. They're forgetful.
Yeah.
They, they're being silly. Like,
yeah.
A lot of that is kind of passed off. Whereas for those born male, the energy sometimes is like an expectation that this is a typical boy
thing. Yes.
So they're being more hyperactive. This is normal, but it's not until they get into a place where society expects them to behave a certain way, like a classroom.
Yeah.
Where then it's like, oh, wait, pause.
Yes.
Something's happening.
Yes.
And then that's often where the diagnosis can come from.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
100%.
And since we're talking about diagnosis, I mean, we're jumping around a little bit.
Yeah.
But since we're talking about diagnosis, what are the benefits of a diagnosis?
So this comes a little bit from like research that I've read, a little bit from clients that I've worked with, and a little bit from my personal experience. So like just kind of putting that out there. And also disclaimer, obviously I haven't read all of the research.
Yes,
so
we're just coming in with our info.
Yes, so disclaimers there. But from my understanding, right, like I think when you're undiagnosed as a kiddo, you end up like internalizing a lot of the messages that you get, right? So it's like, okay, this kid's lazy, or this kid's just not trying hard enough. Oh, this kid has so much potential, but they're just not living up to it because they're not like willing to do the work or willing to do what it takes. And right? And like and when you kind of adults in your life are kind of giving you these messages, and like obviously not because they're necessarily trying to be cruel, but right, like this, like they themselves don't know and they don't understand why this kid isn't applying themselves, like I say in air quotes, right? Like they're not applying themselves. That's like a big thing. And so you internalize all of these messages, and this is where those like, secondary diagnoses end up coming in, those other issues with like depression, anxiety, self-esteem issues, all of these things, because you internalize all of these messages like, I must just be lazy, I'm just not good enough, I'm just right, because we are comparing somebody to a neurotypical standard, not recognizing that their brain functions differently. And with a diagnosis, we could be like, okay, if this kiddo's got like combined or inattentive or hyperactive ADHD, or, and let's bring other things in there, right? Like, learning disabilities, or maybe like even things like, like I was mentioning, like I've heard, right, like even schizophrenia and things like that can kind of come into this, right? But it's like, whatever the specific diagnosis is, if we can understand what that is, we can understand how to better support this individual to function in the way that makes sense for them, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, by getting a diagnosis, I think it can just be supportive in the sense that we can now know how to better support them. Does that mean it's necessary to have a diagnosis? I don't think so. I don't think you need a diagnosis to be able to do those things.
Right.
But I just feel like, kind of in terms of just how we function as like a society, I think people can just, right? Like, it's like, I think it would be cool if we could just look at people, as human, and be like, okay, this person struggles in these areas, and so how do we just support this human for who they are, and help them, like, you know, reach their specific potential. And right, like, I think, like, is a diagnosis like necessary? Not necessarily, but I do think it allows us to just be more compassionate, be more understanding, be more like, you know, let's actually work together to figure out what you need in this, and like, how can we support you, versus like putting the blame on the kiddo for not like applying themselves or doing what it takes or whatever.
It's like the awareness, right?
It is,
like the awareness and the understanding that, okay, this kiddo takes in information differently, or this person takes in information differently. So how can I support them by, you know, maybe being more patient, maybe asking them what they need from me to get things done a certain way, or be able to use supports. But I think, like, you're right, like, a diagnosis is helpful, because sometimes what I have found for both, like, individuals, like clients, and in my personal life, has been that a diagnosis kind of just gave them like, okay, so this is why, like, this is why I'm feeling that way. So I'm not lazy. I'm not like not living up to my full potential. Like, there's something within me where I don't have that capacity to perform in this way. Just like in this box that I've been put in. Like, maybe I can perform and excel the expectations other people have of me, but I need certain things to help me get there.
Exactly.
So that's what I've heard a lot of, and that's amazing. And so then for a diagnosis, that can be really like relieving to be like, okay, great. So there is something, and it's not fully within my control. But I think also there is still, like, like you mentioned, do you need a diagnosis? Not necessarily, but I think sometimes there's still a stigma around a diagnosis. And I think more so, and I apologize for generalizing, but I've seen it more so from parents to kids. So parents sometimes not wanting to get their kids a diagnosis because they don't want the kids to then fall on their diagnosis as like an excuse. So like, I can't do this because I have ADHD. When in reality, I haven't found that very common. A lot of kiddos and like teens that I have worked with have communicated like, I think I have ADHD. It would be so helpful for my parents to know that I have ADHD, so that their expectations of me can change, or so they can understand the challenges that I'm currently experiencing. But I find that there's still a lot of that stigma of like, nope, I give you that label, and that label stays with you forever, and you're going to use it as an excuse. And it can be a huge support.
I think there's a generational piece there, right? Because like kiddos today are kind of growing up with this being a lot more like, hey, this is a thing. It's not a good or a bad thing. It just is a thing. Right? And like, knowing this thing helps me do what I need to do in a way that's easier for me and allows me to do better. Right? But I think, right, generations prior, like, these things are like, oh, like ADHD, oh, autism, like, oh, like these are bad things, and these are things, and like, rightfully so, right? Because they were so stigmatized.
They were,
and these things were so like not understood. Right. And so I think, right, like, there's a bit of that internalized, like, that stigma that kind of is like, okay, well, you know, and I think there's this, right, between the two generations now, there's this like, wow, the kids these days are just getting like overdiagnosed and blah, 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 blah. And like, I don't know, I'm not the expert. I don't know where the truth in that really is. But honestly, my personal belief is just that I think we just have more education now. We have more research. We have more understanding. And so we're catching people more. We're catching these groups, right? Like more, and like these adults who didn't have these supports back then, like now are having the knowledge and the education to know, like, hey, you know, maybe that's what it was for me, and then they're going out and seeking those diagnoses and things like that. But like, I think you're right. Sorry,
that's okay.
In the sense that, like, right, like I think sometimes there can be that kind of like that clash between like parents and kiddos, and so I think, right, like, it's kind of like I think it's important for us, you know, people like us who are in these fields, it's important to kind of normalize these things a little bit more and provide education and have these conversations.
And to advocate for our clients, because sometimes, especially for our younger clients, a lot of that does fall on the parents to help them get that diagnosis. But if they believe they have it, there are still tools that are helpful regardless if you have ADHD or not. It's still such a helpful aid. So like that's something that definitely can help out with like therapy or even like their own research and understanding and reflecting on on themselves for what they might be needing that's going to support their attention. Or again, like you mentioned, your phone is your best friend. You learned somewhere in that putting your reminders and things like that on your phone is going to be helpful. I had a client that was always losing their phone, and they got a really cute case for it. They put some special stickers on them, and that was something that then helped them remember their phone and be excited about it and make sure that they have it on them as well. So there are these aids, these supports that you can have for yourself regardless of a diagnosis or not.
Absolutely.
There's another, I guess, conversation around there too about ADHD symptoms being very similar to trauma symptoms. So what are your what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, this is so fun for me. Okay. There's, right, like so complex PTSD specifically. So like not just like regular PTSD, but like complex PTSD is like, right, like this what's complicated, I guess, determining between complex PTSD and something like even like autism or ADHD is oftentimes like complex PTSD will be something that you get diagnosed with like kind of later in life after you've been through some like long-term sort of like traumatic experiences growing up while you're young, right? Like that's not the only time you can be diagnosed with complex PTSD, but that's one. And so typically, like if you've had a lot of, right, like traumatic experiences that were kind of just part of your normal day-to-day life growing up as a child, so your brain developed in that environment, right? And a lot of the symptoms, I guess, of complex PTSD kind of mirror symptoms of ADHD or autism, even, for example, like, you know, like level 1 autism, perhaps, in the sense that it impacts your executive functioning, it impacts your, like, you know, ability to, like, retain information, your memory, like, your sense of self, your identity, like, it impacts so many things. But the thing with ADHD and autism is they're developmental, like your neurodevelopmental things, right? So it's like you would have had them as a child before the age of 12. You have to have had those symptoms. So how do you tease apart between complex PTSD, which would have been something you would have experienced as a child, and then something like ADHD or autism, which is also something that had to have been present since you were a child, right? Like that's where, like, I've kind of heard that it can get a little bit tricky, but people can have both. And a lot of times, like some of the research that I've kind of read is that growing up neurodivergent in a kind of neurotypical society in and of itself can be a little bit traumatizing for people. Right? Because you are, right, like things don't work the way that you work, and you're constantly having to kind of figure those things out. And a lot of these, you know, as kids, you know, these individuals will have maybe like experienced bullying and things, and like isolation and feeling disconnected and right, like all of those kinds of things. So it's very possible to kind of have both, but basically that's kind of the thing that can be hard to tease apart. I think a good clinician will be able to kind of support you in kind of figuring out like, okay, are these struggles coming from like an ADHD or autism diagnosis, or all these struggles coming from like a CPTSD sort of situation? Because like those, a lot of the things you even mentioned, you named earlier with the inattentive, like what are some of the traits of like inattentive ADHD? Very similar to somebody who might have a complex PTSD diagnosis, right? And so like there's lots of overlap between the two. If you actually like look at them side by side, a lot of it would be overlapping.
And I guess we haven't really touched on autism. There's been, when I was younger growing up, it was autism and Asperger's. So there was
another change.
That's been another change that's happened recently, and now it's level 1, level 2 autism. It's more of like a spectrum disorder, and level 3. Do you know what the differences are between those?
I couldn't speak to them like in like details, but basically, right, like higher support needs. So level 1 is the lowest,
mildest form,
the lowest support needs, and then level 3 is the highest support needs. And so basically that's kind of the spectrum there, like in terms of, now here's the thing, like with autism, we kind of think of it as a line. We think like linearly, like lowest support needs to highest support needs. But it's actually more like a circle with like split up into different pies, and so there's like executive functioning, and there's like memory deficits, and there's like sensory struggles, social difficulties, and the list goes on. And within each of those you can be high or low support needs,
right?
And those can shift day to day depending on your environment,
the people,
how you're doing internally, how much sleep you got, la 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 la. Now, obviously, there's some staticness. That's why you would be diagnosed anywhere from level 1, level 2, level 3.
Right.
But like that's just like another like misconception people kind of have. It's like, oh, it's you're either from here to here, but autism within itself, same with ADHD, same with any other, right? Like neurodivergent sort of diagnosis, like there's no one specific presentation. There's vast amounts of presentations within them, and and so like that's kind of where the spectrum thing kind of comes in when it comes to autism. Sorry,
there's been so much like in the media, like I'm thinking Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. There's a show about a doctor. I don't watch the show, so I can't remember the name. But there's a show about a doctor who is supposed to have autism in the show, and then like it's just we've seen it a lot. Do you think the representation of it in some of those shows is an accurate representation, or very much geared towards one thing, kind of using it? Like for The Big Bang Theory, it was used for comical purposes. Like Sheldon was very rigid in certain things. And I think even the creators of that said like, no, he doesn't have autism. But there's a lot of things that he does that can like present that way.
I think, like, my thoughts on it personally, I think, is that I can't speak to whether it's necessarily accurate or inaccurate. What I will say is maybe it's a bit stereotypical.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
For sure.
Like, I think the presentations can be very stereotypical because, of course, there are individuals with autism that do have a very severe level of rigidity and so on, right? And I think sometimes what those shows don't do right is they don't speak to like how debilitating that can be for individuals, right? Like we kind of laugh about it in shows and things like that, but like the seriousness of that can be kind of lost in those kinds of things. But I think like in general, though, just to kind of speak to the question that you did ask, I think the representation can be a bit stereotypical and perhaps a bit romanticized. Is kind of, I think, my personal opinion on those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that it's being talked about a lot more because I think at one point, like, autism was seen in a very negative way as like a huge disability, and parents would be, obviously struggling with a diagnosis,
and which
like
it can
that.
be for some
For
individuals,
sure,
right?
yes.
With like level 3 autism, like for some, especially when there's other learning disabilities and things like that are kind of combined with that, because these things don't, right? Like sometimes people have multiple kind of disorders that are kind of working together. And so like for some people, absolutely it can be that way, and like we don't want to like take away from the struggle and the difficulty of that, right? Individuals who are like nonverbal and like struggling and like really, you know, like struggle with the hardest parts of those disabilities. Like I can't take away from that and fully accurately speak to that either, right? Like I would love to have
me too. Like, if you know anybody, share in the comments.
Yeah, like I would love to have those voices here, and like I do try to keep myself informed on like all levels of the spectrum, right? Like I think a lot of kind of what we're talking about today, and a lot of kind of I think what's been talked about is more of like the lower support needs neurodivergence, right? So these individuals that are kind of like highly masked and able to mask and like kind of present themselves as a bit more typical. Like I think we're kind of talking about a lot of those folks, but you know, there's a whole group of folks I think that we can't forget about when we're kind of having these conversations.
And I think with that too, it's like, you know, as much as supports for the individual or child who has a diagnosis, obviously that's very important, but I think also the caretakers
absolutely
like also require a level of support. And again, this could be its own podcast episode, but I remember watching, I think it was like somewhere on social media, and it was a mom was dressing their nonverbal kiddo, and they said like she was singing a song, and the nonverbal kiddo like said good morning.
Oh, yes.
And the mom just started like bawling her eyes out and had to like go and take a little break. There was just so much joy in like getting a couple of words in from a kiddo who is nonverbal. And I just, in that moment, like I was like, I hope she has supports for those difficult moments, because that can be so hard. So I think like, again, that can be its episode all on its own, but I think it's important that there's also that level of support and awareness for the caregivers that are caring for like individuals like of all of these stages. So caregiver could be parents, a relative, a partner, friends, like just anyone in general. So
one thing as I was sort of speaking, just want to correct myself, and I guess both of us. So I know that now the term is actually non-speaking instead of nonverbal. I believe like I've kind of been like, that's kind of what I've been hearing more from the community, is that instead of using nonverbal, the terminology is actually non-speaking. So I'm going to correct us on that.
Thank you so much. And I think there's always like there's so much information that's always changing, so I appreciate that correction. So now kind of jumping back into those caregivers, like how are friendships, relationships, how are they impaired or different, I guess, between neurotypical and neurodivergent folks? So we got some comments on social media from individuals saying that it can sometimes be an area that can be frustrating for, I think this was more so with partners or maybe in friendships, like the lack of focus, remembering tasks, important dates, and sometimes it impacts friendships and romantic relationships because there is conflict due to the forgetfulness or lack of focus.
Right.
So I guess how are they then impacted?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think in a relationship, right? Like there's two parties involved and like two brains involved and two brains that are wired differently and do things a little bit differently and perhaps have different expectations, right? And so like, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like if I think in those spaces, I think finding that like common ground and like of like, what are your expectations and what are mine, and like how do we kind of find a way to find that common ground, and then how do we the things that are different, like how do we figure that out together, right? Like I think, but that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like especially like if you, even within, it doesn't even have to be neurotypical and neurodivergent. It could be two neurodivergent folks, and it could be two neurotypical folks, right? Like two neurodivergent folks, like, right, for example, like something like autism, the thing that people kind of forget about is like there could be like two very opposite extremes within autism, right? And it's like, so like, you know, if you have somebody, like if you have two people that are quite opposite from each other, like how are they going to find a way? Like maybe one person has a very rigid way of making sure that they like get those tasks done, and those things are very important to them, and then like another person who maybe doesn't have that ability to kind of do that, and so how do they figure out how to, right? So I feel like it doesn't even have to be just between neurotypical and neurodivergent. It really could be between anybody, any group, right? And so like I think that it makes a lot of sense to me that, you know, sometimes those struggles can kind of come up. And so yeah, like how do we, like, is our focus here to maybe like give some tips on maybe how to find that common ground? Do we want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned some of that. Again, like this will probably be an episode in the future where we'll talk a little bit more about relationships, but I think, yeah, you're right. Like regardless of the quote unquote diagnosis or neurodivergent, neurotypical, I think it also comes up with, there's so much. This was like, we talked about it in our identity one, like culture, upbringing, expectations, relationships that you saw, like an important date being forgotten. Could that be due to like a diagnosis? Sure. But it could also happen if a person's very busy, has a lot going on, is feeling stressed, like all of these other things can impact that. So I think communication is huge. And also checking in with one another's expectations, like you mentioned, but also what's important. Because for one person, the day-to-day things may be important, but for another person's like, oh, I want to at least have the acknowledgement that it's our wedding anniversary, or you know, this is how long we've been dating. And so I think it is important to have those kinds of conversations regardless of a diagnosis, to be able to just, you know, hopefully understand each other a little bit better, and again, check in on expectations.
Yeah, absolutely, right? And like I think there's absolutely ways for like, so for example, like my husband and I just, to keep up on the dishes, like all the, like that is just so stressful as a thing for me to just like keep in my mind all the time. So it's like, so it just worked for us. It just works for us where like he kind of takes care of like the day-to-day chores, like, you know, like having to like keep up on the garbage and like the dishes and just like, you know, those kinds of things. Whereas I'm better with like the big, like, okay, I clean like the bathroom. I do like the big cleans or like the deeper cleans. Like those are things that I'm like, okay, like each week every week I'm doing this, and then I'm doing this, and then I'm doing this, and I'm better able to kind of focus on that, and then I can do those things better if he's able to keep up with like the day-to-day things. And so like, and then like, you know, we will like support each other here and there. Like there's gonna be times where like he's stressed and has a lot going on, so I have to pick up a bit and like, you know, get involved in doing the more of the day-to-day things, and vice versa. But like generally speaking, we just have this thing that works where like, right, like, you know, he kind of does the more day-to-day stuff, and I do like the big, you know, things that need to be done, you know, each week or every few days kind of thing. Right? So like, I think you just got to figure out what your 50-50 quote unquote looks like, or like, you know, maybe it doesn't even have to be that. It just depends.
It's like, just like the communication, right? Because I think chores, okay, so something with ADHD is that sometimes there is executive dysfunction. And so I guess before we got there, because this can apply to some relationships and just work, school, like all of those things in general, like some examples of executive dysfunction are focusing too much on one thing. So you mentioned like being so focused on one task that you forget to eat, you forget to like connect or do whatever you need to do. On the opposite end, it also means being easily distractible. So if you're not too focused, you're easily distracted. Daydreaming or spacing out when you shouldn't be, struggling to switch between tasks, problem with impulse control, and sometimes trouble starting difficult or boring tasks. So I think we hear a lot about this in terms of procrastination.
Yes.
I have to get this thing done for work, but it's so boring. I can't do it. I'm procrastinating. So I think a lot of that falls into those relationship quote unquote conflicts that can happen, because it can be like the chores, like, hey, nobody did the dishes. Okay, maybe that needs to be a conversation. Or, you know, like you're so focused on, you know, playing your video game, or you're so focused on the assignment that you have to do for work that you neglected me. I need time for connection. I need attention. And again, there can be a lot of resentment that is built when that can be a conversation to gain understanding as to where our partner is at. And that's when aids are helpful, right? Like a phone, a timer, so that you at least have like a little check-in. It's been 2 hours that you've been focused on this task. Do I need to go to the washroom? Do I need to connect with people around me? Do I need to eat? Like, and being able to kind of have like that as like a cue to take you out of that focus. The other one that came up was having a difficult time switching between tasks. So that can also happen, especially, I'm going to say, like, as a family, because you have kiddos and you're having to switch from like helping with homework, cooking dinner, making sure that like the sink isn't overflowing with dishes, or like, you know, navigating like an email you just got from work. Like, there's so many things. And so switching from all of those tasks can be quite overwhelming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like a big one for that is like, right, like, as the transition time is important, right? Like, I think, again, anybody could benefit from that. But I think, you know, there are certain folks, you know, that are neurodivergent that need that. Like, that's the difference, right? Like, you know, it's, somebody can get very irritable, really, or like really just like disoriented, or whatever the case may be. It may look like defiance. It may look like, you know, they're being rude, or you know, et cetera, but they actually need that time to transition from one task to the other, right? And so like, you know, Cash and I, like my husband and I, like have had these conversations where, you know, we're like, and he, you know, he's not diagnosed, but I know that he's got some stuff going on for him too. So we both have had these conversations where like, okay, like, you know, we got to give each other like some cues of like, hey, like, I'm going to need you in like 10 minutes, or right. Like, it's like, so it's like, it's not like, hey, immediately right now, I need you to do this thing. Like, hey, just giving you a heads up. You know, I need your attention in about 10 minutes, or like whatever. Like whatever the case may be, everybody figures out their own way.
Like, but that's communication, right? Like, you're letting the other person know. And I think you're right. Like, if you need that downtime between tasks, and it hasn't been communicated or acknowledged that that's something you need, it can be like you're avoiding work, you're making me do everything, you're being lazy. Like, and all of those comments can come up in a relationship too. And again, like, that's not helpful. And there's conflict, and then there's resentment, and then there's like all of those things. So I think like the big key thing that we're talking about is just being able to communicate what it is that you are needing. And if your partner doesn't quite understand what it is that you're needing or why you're needing it, then being able to be, I mean, both parties be open to that education of what the other person may need. And at least creating that safe space for the person to communicate what they're needing, and for you to have that space of understanding. Because like, again, at the beginning, I opened up with my husband always shaking his foot, and that's really annoying to me because he shakes the whole ground. But like, if that's something that he's needing, it's being able to have that conversation. So I'm not like, oh, you're being so annoying shaking your foot. It can be like, okay, like, you need your energy.
You go in that room,
go over
and
there,
shake your foot, and I'm gonna go in the other room.
Or go to the other couch. I love you. Go over there, shake your foot there, so you can move that couch that I'm not on. So like, there can still be like a space for that conversation, understanding.
It's like I said, like, it's not just like neurotypical against neurodivergent. Like, that's not like, you know what I mean? Like, this is even within neurotypical groups, within neurodivergent groups, like, right? Like, two people, like, I can have like opposite sensory issues, like, you know, one person needs to hear things very, very loud, and the other person's super sensitive to loud stuff. How do you navigate that?
Exactly.
You're gonna have to, right? We have to find ways to let both parties get what they need, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that means like, okay, you go do over there and do that thing, and I'm gonna go over there and do my thing.
Yeah.
And that's okay,
yes.
right?
As
like,
long as it's been communicated and you're not just ditching a person
exactly.
and going. But that's why like the key thing is communication, and that's throughout the board. Like just in any kind of relationship, even with friendships, it's important to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Again, that could be its episode all on its own, and it shall be one day.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we've talked a lot about diagnosis. So there's diagnosis and there's self-diagnosis. If you are interested in getting diagnosed professionally, or like, you know, what's the word? Like an actual...
Like a formal
diagnosis. Thank you. That's the word. Yeah. A formal diagnosis. How does one go about doing that?
So, like, it's a bit tricky, right? Because diagnoses can be expensive.
Yes.
And I think that's a big reason why like self-diagnosis has become more of a thing now. And I know, like, I'm not going to speak to like self-diagnosis as a whole. Like, I know there's like a bunch of different views and opinions on it, right? Like, but like I see the importance of it for some people, right? Like, it's like, if like there was this thing that I read, and it was like, it talked about how like and this was somebody's personal like story that I was reading, and they basically said like I'm self-diagnosed with like autistic, and somebody asked me like, how do you know that what you have is autism? And they were like, you know, well, they were like, as a joke first I was like, well, 5 autistics told me I'm autistic, so I think I'm gonna trust that. But then they were like, but then I actually, you know, laughed and thought, and I was like, well, I don't know that I'm autistic. I really don't. But what I do know is that since I started to view myself through a lens of autism, things just started to make sense for me. I was able to be kinder to myself. I was able to understand myself better in a way that I've never been able to before. And recognizing, you know, my sensory difficulties and having the language and the label for those things, I am now able to advocate for myself in a way that I wasn't able to before. And so viewing myself through this lens makes my life easier, and it allows me to do things in ways I have never been able to do before. Right. And so like, I don't know that I, you know, am autistic,
but it's whatever. Benefiting them.
But it's supporting me. And so like, you know, that's kind of why this is important to me, right? And so like, you know, I just share that, like, people can take from that what they want. But I think that's where like self-diagnosis comes in handy, because to like assessments like can be like upwards of like $3,000. Right?
They
like
can be quite expensive.
They can be quite expensive. And like, yes, there's ways, especially for kids, like pediatricians can technically like diagnose some things. And like you can get referrals to psychiatrists and things like that.
So always start off with going to your family doctor.
Yes, always family doctor is the first point of contact. It's important to share with them what your concerns are, what's kind of going on for you.
And from there could be a referral.
From there they can do a referral. Things can be a bit lengthy, but they don't always have to cost money if you go that route.
There's a longer wait list at times.
So like, I know for kiddos, like I know Kids Ability, like a family doctor can refer you to Kids Ability, and I think if you're under 18 they can do like an autism assessment, for example. And then but like I said, a family doctor could also refer you to a pediatrician who could do an assessment and refer and diagnose. Here's the other thing, like I will say, right, like not every professional is going to be an expert on ADHD or autism or OCD or whatever the case may be, right? Like if you're going privately, I mean, right, and you're kind of paying out of pocket and you're like paying thousands of dollars, I think it's important to kind of do your research on who you are gonna have assess you, right? Because if they don't have, like, if they only have limited experience with certain things, then it's, if you present differently from what's considered like, you know, the typical presentation of that diagnosis, then, you know, you might get misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
Like, for lack of a better word.
And I think too, like, we're human, right?
We're human, yeah.
And doctors have different experiences with different areas.
Exactly. So, like, do your research.
Yes.
Like, I think.
Self-advocate. If a doctor's like, nope, you're fine, just advocate for yourself.
Yeah.
That can be really difficult
Yeah.
to, like, be turned away so quickly.
Yeah.
But definitely, like, advocate for yourself, stand up for yourself. You have a right to ask for a referral.
Yeah.
So just making sure that you are being vocal with that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, exactly. So I think family doctor is always a great first point of contact for anybody, right? Because from there, like, you can get referrals, and maybe there's ways for you to kind of get these supports, like, covered, so you don't have to pay for them. But right, if you do have benefits, let's say, and you do have the ability to kind of go private, like, you know, like going on Psychology Today, for example, and like kind of looking up the psychologists that are in your area. Like, psychologists will do those assessments, and there's a lot of psychologists that will do them, like, privately, and kind of so you can definitely go on, like, Psychology Today and do your research on, okay, what are the expertise of this psychologist, and then based on that you can reach out and do a consultation and talk to them first for free before you then kind of commit to a full assessment.
Yeah. So there's lots of ways to go about it, and if you are self-diagnosing, like, that's okay too. If it's something that's supporting you, if it's helping you understand yourself a little bit better and communicate things with the people around you, then that's wonderful. And that's great that you were able to find something that is able to support you in that way.
Absolutely.
We are going to be talking about this a little bit more specifically in the future at some point. But for now, are there any last thoughts you have on our topic today?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a very vast and complex topic. And a lot of people have different views and different opinions, and I think, right, it's important to kind of honor all the different, like, sides of this topic. It's a topic that's definitely very near and dear to my heart. And so I really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Yes, cool. Me too. Thank you so much, Arsh, and we hope we'll have you back to talk a little bit more about this. But thank you everyone for joining us. Again, make sure to follow us on Outside the Therapy Room pod on Instagram and TikTok. And thanks again for joining us. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.